My name's John, and I'm recently retired from the Washington State Patrol. I did the full 25, made it to lieutenant, and got my pension, and all in all, I'd say that I have very few regrets. But just like every other former cop out there, I got one or two cases that have followed me into retirement, some for the better and some for worse. Now, in early 2019, the State Patrol's Missing and Unidentified Persons Unit commenced a cold case initiative. Now, the goal was to assign a small group of experienced detectives to the piles of unsolved missing person cases sitting in the unit's archives. And since by then I had 12 years under my belt, it didn't surprise me when I got the call. We met one Monday morning when one of the MUPU guys showed us to the filing cabinet containing their cold cases. Looking inside felt like playing Russian roulette with all 6 chambers full, because no matter which one we picked, it was going to be a mess. And that's why we were the chosen ones, I guess, because we could handle messy and not burn out and end up chasing wild geese. But the very first one I picked ended up being one of the dirtiest and downright darkest cases I'd ever worked. And to protect those involved, I've omitted the names of all those involved, so my apologies if my prose is clunky in certain parts. But back in 2014, a retired oil rig supervisor and former Army engineer went missing from his home in Pullman. Now, his car was found a few weeks later over the state line in Idaho at a motel near McCroskey State Park. There were no signs of struggle near his car or in his hotel room, and the motel's security cameras showed him leaving the site on foot, looking calm and collected. The investigating detective noted that voluntary disappearance was a distinct possibility, since during the months prior to his disappearance, the missing man's marriage had deteriorated drastically. Yet there was no activity on any of his bank accounts, so if he had disappeared someplace, it was on somebody else's dime. Now, the first thing on my agenda was to go talk to the missing man's wife. She was a warm and friendly woman, but carrying the pain of her husband's disappearance for 5 long years had clearly taken its toll on her. She was living with a friend, a man who was evidently playing the role of a surrogate husband. But since both believed her husband was still alive, neither seemed prepared to make their affair public. If in fact there was an affair, and what they shared wasn't a platonic companionship. The missing man's wife confirmed that for around 6 months prior to his disappearance, their relationship had been strained. He'd been distant, preoccupied, and perpetually irritable, but for the life of her, she couldn't get him to tell her why. He'd been retired from the oil industry for a couple of years by that point, so it couldn't have been work getting to him. The only clue to his poor mental state was the fact that he spent long hours in the evening talking to an old Army friend of his. Those nightly conversations continued right up until the day before he disappeared, and then when his wife woke up alone that morning, she found nothing but a note on the table which said, "I'm sorry, there's something I need to do." It was believed that McCroskey Motel, the one that his car was found at, had served as the meeting place between him and this old Army friend he spent so much time talking to. And so, according to the wife, if anyone knew where he'd be, it'd be him. The only trouble was he'd refused to talk to anyone about his dealings with her husband, not even the local sheriff's department. She gave me the Army buddy's contact details and advised me to reach out to him, albeit very gently and very politely. But then on the walk back to my car, the lady's friend caught up with me and had a thing or two of his own to share with me. Namely, his belief that the lady's missing husband was off working for the CIA. This friend seemed absolutely convinced that both our missing person and his old Army buddy had both been working for the CIA on and off since they left the Army. He said that he wasn't heading off around the country supervising oil rigs. He was going to CIA black sites to study extraterrestrial materials and technology. And when I asked what proof he had, the friend admitted that he didn't have much. But then again, he was right in that you can't just go calling the CIA and asking if such and such a person is an agent, because all you get in return is that movie cliche of, we can neither confirm nor deny. He was basing his theory around his suspicion that the old Army friend lived the life of a CIA agent in that he traveled overseas a lot, had no obvious source of income, and spent a lot of time flying down to Reagan Airport, which services the CIA headquarters at Langley. I asked him how he knew all of this and was told that he'd done all of his own research. He was also quick to add that it was research the old Army buddy hadn't taken kindly to. But in the friend's mind, that only confirmed the man's guilt. He then shared his belief that our missing person's final meeting with his old Army buddy had actually been a kind of recruitment session, and that after swearing himself to secrecy, our missing person was off working on some secret project at some secret base somewhere. The wife's friend told me a bunch of other stuff about UAPs and Tic Tacs, as he called them, and both of which I found out were these new way of jargon meaning UFO. And as you can imagine, I didn't find myself taking many notes by the time he got around to all that stuff, but he was right about my next port of call being this old Army buddy. He was also right when he told me that finding our missing person would involve wading into some very murky and very dangerous waters, just not in the ways he might have believed. Now, having received the old Army buddy's contact details, I gave him a call as soon as I was able. But the UFO guy was right about how blunt he could be, and that's putting it kindly, because no sooner had I explained that I was calling about his missing friend, he made his feelings abundantly clear. He told me to never, ever call me again, and if he saw me sneaking around his property like that damn tinfoil hat son of a bitch, those are his words, by the way, he'd have me thrown in jail, just like he did with that goddamn ET-obsessed a-hole. His words again. And it was only then that I discovered that the UFO guy hadn't just conducted his own investigation as such, but had rather directed a prolonged campaign of harassment toward the old Army buddy, one that had resulted in an arrest being made. Now, the old Army buddy might have told me to get lost, but I didn't make detective by giving up that easy. I knew a former military man like him would respond much better to seeing a badge in person rather than hearing just a name over the phone. But before then, I knew he'd need some time to cool off, because approach too quick and that angry old bastard might have done more than just file a complaint. Instead, I decided to look into the missing man's background a little more to see if that'd provide any clues. And boy, did it ever. Like I said, you can't just go asking the CIA who's an agent and who's not. But the Army, on the other hand, they'll tell you just about anything you damn well ask, so long as the person's been discharged. His wife had told me our missing person had been a radio technician, and for a time, that was certainly true. But by the date of his discharge, he was serving in a very different role. Without getting too technical with the military speak, our missing person was part of an engineer battalion, but for some reason, served in an intelligence capacity following a period of specialized training. This is what's called an out-of-branch role, and while they're not unheard of, they're usually temporary positions that fill gaps in the organization, but our missing person spent 3 years in that intelligence role, while taking at least a few months out of each year to be trained by intelligence guys. Now, this was all interesting enough, but what really got my attention was how the Army couldn't seem to tell me why our missing person was discharged. All they provided me with was the date of it, October 5th of 2001. Now, to me, out of all the strange things I'd uncovered regarding our missing person, this was the strangest. And for the benefit of any young whippersnappers listening to this in the years to come, here's why it was so strange. So, less than a month before that discharge date, America experienced some attacks that happened in September of that year, the largest single loss of life on American soil committed by a foreign actor. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives, the New York skyline was irreparably altered, and folks from sea to shining sea wanted to get themselves some goddamn payback. Over 30,000 extra troops signed up over the next 6 months alone, and retention rates shot way up too, with more than ever choosing to re-enlist rather than miss out on going after Bin Laden and his boys. But then, if that was the case, how come our missing person not only turned down some pretty lucrative signing bonuses, but had his discharge fast-tracked? If he'd stayed enlisted for just 18 more months, he'd be entitled to his Army pension. And if I didn't know any better, I'd say it constituted a pretty shocking display of cowardice. But our missing person was certainly no coward. He'd served honorably in several war zones prior to the sudden discharge, and had even earned himself a Bronze Star for what he and his men did in Panama. Which had me wondering, did he really leave the engineers right after September of 2001 and opt to give up all that pension money? Or, much like undercover cops do, was he transferred someplace secret to be what you might call a deniable asset? The way to safely rule that out was to draw up a list of likely employers in the oil industry and then tick them off one by one until I found the one our missing person worked for. But when this went on for 3 whole days without result, I must have tried at least 100. And then, things finally made sense. Our missing person hadn't been working at an oil firm at all, and he'd lied to his wife and friends about where he was going. So what in the hell was he doing instead? I placed a few calls to his wife to arrange another talk. When she didn't answer any of them, I figured that she was just busy and told myself to be patient. But then the very next day, I got a call from an unknown cell phone number. Now I figured she'd switched numbers and I'd been calling the old one, so I picked up and said something like, "Hi there, thanks for calling me back." But it wasn't our missing person's wife. It was his old army buddy, the one who told me never to call him again. And as it turned out, there had been a major miscommunication that had resulted in years of misunderstanding. You see, the old army friend didn't understand the severity of the situation. He figured there had been a divorce, maybe some infidelity, and then after running off someplace, his old friend just didn't want to talk anymore. Now, he didn't know his safety was in question, and if he had, he wouldn't have brushed off the first cop he spoke to 5 years previous. He knew his friend was troubled, he just didn't know how troubled. And then when he finally found out his old friend was actually missing, the first thing he did was give me a call. Now, I can't say too much about this old army buddy because he ended up telling me things that'd get him in a whole heap of trouble if his old bosses found out. But in the interests of uncovering the truth, he was more than willing to speak freely, just not over the phone. We met in person, somewhere private, and he told me that while the UFO guy had been crazier than a bag of hammers, he was right about one thing, and one thing alone. And that's how the old army buddy and our missing person had actually once served in the Central Intelligence Agency. I'd already established that our missing person had served in an intelligence capacity during his final few years in the Army, albeit in a very unusual one. And according to his buddy, this made him a prime candidate for an agency recruitment in the aftermath of September 2001. Just like I'd suspected, our missing person hadn't quit the Army at a time it needed him most. He just moved to a place where records aren't made public. And while I assumed he was given a job similar to the one he'd been doing in the engineers, I was very wrong. He hadn't been some kind of intelligence analyst. His job was very euphemistically titled interrogator. Unfortunately for the whippersnappers, it's time for another quick history lesson. Now, that time in September 2001 was a very dark time for America, obviously. Not just because of all the lives lost or how we realized our enemies could use our own liberties and successes against us, but also because of what we resorted to. Folks were so dead set on revenge and so scared that our enemies had something else up their sleeves that we ripped up the rulebook in a way that had the founding fathers rolling in their graves. The Patriot Act was passed, meaning the government had the right to spy on its own citizens in a way that it never, ever had before. But that's not what our missing person was involved with. He was involved in developing and executing so-called advanced interrogation techniques, a very fancy newfangled term that conveniently replaced a very old one: torture. Our missing person, along with his old buddy, was inducted into a large team of CIA interrogators whose job was to fly over to Afghanistan and later to Iraq to extract information from people. Afghanistan had been slim pickings, and most of al-Qaeda guys either escaped into Pakistan or were picked up by U.S. Special Forces and flown to Guantanamo Bay to be interrogated there. But Iraq, and in particular this one city called Fallujah, it was a whole other story. After the invasion, coalition forces were busy dealing with the situation in Baghdad, and for good reason, with it being the center of power. But just 30 miles away, there's this city called Fallujah, and since the coalition was stretched so thin, they had to hire civilian contractors to police the place. International insurgents began using the city as a staging ground. Fallujah was flooded with weapons and equipment, and then in March 2004, 4 of those civilian contractors were ambushed, mutilated, and then hung from a bridge by insurgents as a way of saying, "Come get us." The solution was obvious: send in the Marines. But when they got there, they didn't find a handful of insurgents taking advantage of a city in chaos. They found a fortress. The insurgents fought hard, they fought smart, and they were dug in deep. And this wasn't some grassroots, fist-in-the-air resistance movement either, because while former Iraqi army officers were most definitely running the show, the rank and file consisted of terrorists from all over the world. There were guys from Egypt, Syria, Chechnya, even European countries like France and Germany, and the Marines knew that because they pulled their passports off their bodies after the fighting was done. These guys had to land in Syria and go through passport control just like everyone else, and only some of them had straight up written "Jihad in Iraq" as their reason for entering Syria. Once these guys realized the Marines were going to take the city, a lot of them simply dropped their weapons and tried to blend in with the civilians, rather than go all out in a blaze of glory. And then with the Marines surrounding the place to make sure they couldn't escape, military intelligence went snatching people up left and right before carting them off to the interrogators to see what they knew. And that's where our missing person enters the picture. He and his old buddy were with the Fallujah interrogation unit all throughout 2005, and according to the buddy, it was the single biggest regret of both of their careers. Since all the attention was on Baghdad, the Fallujah unit ran almost completely unsupervised, and things turned real messy real fast. Now firstly, everyone was still very much in payback mode, so knowing that there were so many bad guys in town made them nothing short of bloodthirsty. I was told interrogations are supposed to be cold, withdrawn affairs, where an almost scientific approach is taken to physical and mental suffering. But the old buddies said the Fallujah team were openly talking about how good it felt to be dishing out some punishment. It wasn't even about getting answers anymore. Everyone knew some dumbass Libyan jihadist didn't know jack about September. He was just there because he heard he could shoot at Americans and maybe even secure his spot in paradise in the process. But the team didn't give a good goddamn. If he was there to kill Americans, then he was going to suffer. It got to the point where anyone who wasn't Iraqi-born was getting dragged off the street and interrogated, and not all of them made it through. The team had all kinds of people dragged in there, and some of them were tortured to death. The old army buddies said walking through their headquarters, which was heavily guarded and set up a few miles away in the desert, was like a living nightmare. All you could hear day and night were the screams. The place had to be constantly cleaned too because the smell of all that blood attracted flies, so it either smelled so heavily of bleach and other crap that it'd make your head ache, or it reeked of blood and you were constantly swatting flies away from your face. Anyone who died during interrogation ended up getting buried outside in the desert, and in the rare case the person was truly innocent, they were dumped by the side of the road for the rats and stray dogs to find. Everyone knew how terrible it was too. They hated the screams, they hated the stink of blood, they hated the flies. But I was told there was also this sense of, we all got a job to do, and it ain't a nice one, but it's an important one, so suck it up, Buttercup, because we could be the Marines getting our nuts blown off on the front lines. It was the perfect storm of evil, I guess, and I was told that it wasn't until a long time after that that they had this shared, what the hell did we do back there kind of moment. And then over time, as all the WMD stuff turned out to be all bullcrap and everyone found out how rich certain folks got on the back of all that death, they realized that all that pain and suffering they'd inflicted had been for nothing. The old buddies said that this went on for years, with our missing man going from true believer to openly questioning what the hell the US military was even doing in Iraq. Being on the CIA payroll kept him quiet, I guess, but after he retired, I was told our missing person got way, way worse. He took to drinking, and according to his friend, he drank a lot too. He said he needed to be able to sleep, and it went way beyond that as well. He realized just how many innocent people they'd hurt and killed, and how that was becoming harder and harder to live with. What's worse, he didn't have anyone but some agency shrink to talk about it to. His old buddy couldn't be there, not all the time, as he hadn't retired yet, and our missing person couldn't exactly go talking about classified stuff to a civilian doctor either. He was already teetering on the edge, and then something terrible happened. The buddy said that just before New Year's Eve of 2013, our missing person called him in the middle of the night and asked him to go to the website of some Arabic language news channel. There, he found a live video feed coming from a very familiar-looking Iraqi city, and as he watched in horror, our missing person talked him through what he was seeing. Fallujah, the city they'd inflicted 1,000 horrors upon in some sick, misguided attempt to save it, was under siege from a group of militants, one that appeared to be very well armed and very well trained. They were in the process of surrounding the place, just like the Marines had done 9 years before, and then about a week later, they drove out the Iraqi army and declared their first major victory. Neither man knew who the group were at the time, but cut to about 7 to 8 months later, and the whole entire world would know their name. And while that name sounded different depending on what language you spoke, in America, we called them ISIS. The old army buddy didn't know exactly when his friend had disappeared. He just got a call from him in February, not long before his car was found at the motel. But it wasn't hard to figure out the exact date our missing person had gone missing. I called his wife to ask if she could remember the exact date. Without skipping a beat, she said January 4th. It was a Saturday. The exact same day the news broke that Fallujah had fallen to ISIS terrorists. We think that was the straw which broke the proverbial camel's back, because after that, our missing person ended up drinking himself right down into a hole. His old buddy said that when he showed up to the bar that they met at, he looked like he had 1 foot in the grave already. And then all they spoke about were regrets and the lies and how it was all for nothing, absolutely nothing. The meeting didn't end well either. The old buddy suggested that he get help, but his missing friend said nothing could help him anymore. Not booze, not even the church. He said he knew he was going to hell, that he'd inflicted so much pain that he could never even the scales. Now, our missing person also mentioned how they might be the last time that they'd see each other, but I guess the older army buddy didn't see that for what it was, and he left thinking that his old friend couldn't stand to see him anymore. Not when he was that much of a reminder of something he'd do anything to forget. Everything made a little more sense after the call with the old army buddy, and although it stayed off the record, I had a conversation with the missing man's wife confirming his former position at the CIA. And after that, it was a case of figuring out which direction he might have gone on foot following his departure from the motel. And while that proved a difficult process, I hoped that it'd at least give me something to work with. Well, it did, and when I found out what it was nothing short of devastating. It was in a bar that I ended up talking to a man who knew the area well. He'd grown up around McCroskey State Park and spent a lot of time there as a kid, so it was him who told me that the motel our missing person stayed at right before he disappeared was just a half-hour's walk away from a place they called Dead Man's Bridge. He told me the section of river it ran over were rapids, and that if a person fell in, they'd be bashed against the rocks before they hit a section of what's called an undertow. Now this is when submerged obstacles like large rocks cause fast-moving water to go over the top, which creates a strong downward current that can drag swimmers beneath the surface. So basically, fall in the river near Dead Man's Bridge, and it will knock you out and drown you. He said it had become popular with a certain kind of person, people who were just too tired to go on and who saw something almost dignified in letting the river take them. Instead of being washed up downstream, all lifeless and looking like a drowned rat, the river fed into the Columbia, which spits anything that falls into it right out into the Pacific Ocean. And then once you're out there, you're good and gone, and no one's ever going to find you without a submarine and a whole lot of luck. It all suddenly made sense to me, and when it did, It hit me like a ton of bricks. Not just because I felt for our missing person, having been driven so crazy with guilt that he'd most likely opted to check out early, but because it was me who was going to have to tell his wife, a woman who'd been so utterly convinced by her friend that her missing husband was still alive, and that was one of the hardest things I'd ever have to do. Now, without a body, we couldn't officially declare the missing person's case closed, not without a warm or cold body as concrete proof. But after a while, I guess as she slowly came to accept it, the missing man's wife filed a petition to have him declared dead in absentia, which, for those who don't know, is when someone's been missing for so long that the only reasonable explanation is that they're deceased, or in the case of our now grieving wife, when you're 99% sure someone's deceased, you just can't 100% prove it. And only then, once it's been made official, could we take the file out of the cold case cabinet and put it where it belongs. Back in March of 1998, I was a 32-year-old prosecutor here in my native Belgium. I've been in the job for 3 years, so I was still relatively new, and after spending years focused on less significant crimes like financial fraud, I was finally handed my first murder trial. I relished it, knowing that first impressions mattered, and if I may say so myself, I think I did myself proud. My stubbornness, along with a certain refusal to look away from unpleasant facts, impressed my superiors immensely, so much so that a few weeks later, on a drizzly Tuesday morning, I received what I can only describe as a life-changing telephone call. A colleague from the International Criminal Tribunal had seen my file and was particularly impressed by a conviction I'd achieved a few years prior, pertaining to a case involving systematic abuse in Belgian prisons. I'd also written a piece on command responsibility during the Yugoslav wars, with a particular focus on the failure to prevent the genocide of Croats and Bosniaks, and this too had gotten the attention of the ICT. I was offered a job, one that was very well paid and came with a generous expense account, but there was also a catch. I was told they needed someone who understood bureaucracy and blood, the name of my written piece, as well as someone who wouldn't flinch when confronted with evidence of extreme violence. And if I accepted, I'd end up living and working in a place whose name had been synonymous with some of the worst crimes in human history: Rwanda. Now, my first instinct was to say no. I was dealing with a heavy caseload at the time, one of which involved bringing charges against a prolific distributor of CSEM, and I didn't want to walk away from the case, and I didn't want to walk away from my colleagues either. But after giving my hastily conceived answer to the ICT's recruitment officer, I was told that I had a few weeks to think about it. And then over time, my refusal started to feel less and less like a polite decline and more like cowardice. You see, many years before, my own country of Belgium had colonized Rwanda and rolled through a system of ethnic identity which divided people into one of two categories: Hutu or Tutsi. The colonial government vastly favored the Tutsi minority, who were much more keen to cooperate than the Hutu majority. But this only created a huge amount of resentment between the two groups of people, and when the Belgians granted Rwanda its independence, this system of governance didn't change. The Tutsis clung to power, and then by the early 90s, Rwanda wasn't so much a functional state as it was a powder keg just waiting to explode. There was already a civil war brewing by the time the country's Hutu president was assassinated by its own presidential guard, who were also Hutu. Then the extremists behind the plot used his death as a casus belli to begin a slaughter of biblical proportions. Militias known as Interahamwe set up roadblocks, having already drawn up lists of Tutsi officials and other community figures they wished to round up and kill. Radio stations then broadcast names and addresses, calling them cockroaches and urging their extermination. Rwanda wasn't a particularly segregated place either, particularly the larger cities like its capital, Kigali. So while out in the countryside, bands of armed soldiers engaged rebel fighters en masse in the cities, neighbors slaughtered neighbors in the streets outside their homes. In one of the more horrifying accounts of genocide, a Hutu parish priest murdered his own Tutsi parishioners by bayoneting them to death. Others were killed with everyday items such as gardening tools like hoes or shovels. Carnal violation was used as a weapon of war, and any moderate Hutus who tried to give shelter to Tutsi friends received the same treatment as those they tried to protect. In just over 3 months of violence, anywhere between 800,000 to 1 million people were killed. Bodies clogged rivers while mass graves were dug in schoolyards and football fields, and all the while, the international community did next to nothing. The violence only stopped after a militant group named Rwandan Popular Front arrived from the north, stormed the capital city, and restored order. But what remained was truly terrible. What was once a fractured nation had become like a charnel house, and I was all too aware of the violence and the suffering there. And then, since Western governments had done nothing for the people and still hadn't after 4 long years, I thought the least that I could do was help count the dead. I flew into Kigali during the wet season of 1999 and found myself part of a small team including a forensic anthropologist from the United States, a Dutch investigator, a Canadian Special Forces officer acting as security, and 2 Rwandan translators. We were briefed by a senior member of the ICT at a UN encampment. Intelligence reports suggested that there was a rural property in a region south of the capital named Bugesera, in which a Tutsi family had been murdered by a Hutu mob. The files spoke of a series of murders, and I expected perhaps 7 or 8 bodies, but nothing could have prepared me for what we found. Absolutely nothing. It rained so much that by the time we arrived at the property, the road had turned into a red paste that clung to the wheels and to our boots. It looked like many of the other homesteads we passed on the way. Mud brick walls, a tin roof with banana groves sloping down to a small stream below. It was very pretty in its own way, but as soon as we got within about 30 to 40 meters, we started to smell the decay of death inside. Inside the main house, the floors were gray concrete, and it had been stained black in many places where blood had pooled and dried over time. The largest room on the ground floor, the kitchen and dining space, had been converted into a slaughter chamber. Hooks still hung from the ceiling beams, their sharp points still displaying flecks of gore, and a long table had been placed against one of the walls in which deep channels had been carved into the wood to drain fluids. Empty shell casings littered the room, with our security detail pointing out that while most of them were from Russian AKs, a few were from Belgian FALs, weapons made by my country, weapons that we'd left there which were now being used to commit the most horrendous acts of pointless violence, and it made me sick to my stomach. Outside, we found a makeshift crematorium consisting of an oil drum furnace rigged with iron grates, and when I looked inside, I noticed how its interior crusted with charred bone fragments and teeth, and while nearby, a shallow pit had been dug and filled in. We didn't have to scrape away much of the dirt to start finding remains either, and some were small enough to belong to children no older than 8 or 9. And to find such a sizable amount of human remains was one thing, and to know some were children was a horror I can barely describe. But it was the personal effects that broke something in me. In one of the home's back rooms, stacked in a haphazard piles all over the floor, were the clothes of those who had been murdered. There must have been thousands of clothes piled on top of each other, men's shirts, women's shawls, and hundreds of shoes, all missing their pairs. I remember seeing a single red high heel that must have belonged to someone who dressed well for what she thought was a meeting or an arrest. I also remember seeing what I'm quite certain was a part of a school uniform, along with a tiny pair of plastic sandals depicting cartoon characters. What pushed me over the edge was picking up a child's sweater, a pale blue one with a knitted duck on the front. It was stiff with dry blood. I kneeled and set it down carefully, as though disturbing it would wake the dead, and then by the time that I was at my full height again, I was crying. By the end of that day, I wanted to leave that place, leave Rwanda, and never return. But we ended up going to and from that house for 3 whole weeks before I was able to fly home again. Our forensic anthropologist cataloged bones under a tarp in the courtyard, and by the end of those 3 weeks, she estimated that at least 280 individuals had been murdered there, and that's not including those whose remains may have already been incinerated. Our Dutch investigator, a nice man named Peter, interviewed survivors from nearby villages. They said the trucks came at night and how they couldn't sleep because of the screams. One old woman described seeing a Hutu community leader directing operations. Another mentioned soldiers from the former Rwandan armed forces. Peter wrote down many names, but there were no documents, no paper trail, and since the killer had been careful to ensure no cameras were around, so while there were plenty of pictures of the bodies, we couldn't find a single piece of footage depicting killings of any kind. And we seized what little we could. Things like a handful of identity cards were pulled from the pockets of that discarded clothing, or a rusted pistol registered to a man still living openly in Kigali. Now, that was the only significant piece of evidence we found in terms of connecting a murderer to their victims, and only then, it may have accounted for only a handful of deaths in a genocide committed mostly by everyday household items. I remember spending long evenings writing reports by lamplight, drinking warm beer by the dozen to keep the rage from clouding my judgment. And not just rage at the killers either, but rage at my own country of Belgium. It was Belgium who issued the ethnic identity cards in the first place, cards which might as well have been death warrants if they had Tutsi written on them. And just like when we found those bullets, I've never been more ashamed of my country. On the whole, the investigation was an uphill struggle for the first week, and it didn't get any easier as the weeks went by. You might have had an expense account, but there was a strict limit on what we could spend on any given day. Then, because ours was only a small part of a much wider investigation, we received only minimal support for the tribunal's HQ in neighboring Tanzania. Now what's worse, we put people's lives at risk. Now, in many cases, the witnesses we convinced to testify received visits from men on motorcycles after dark, and then the next time we visited them, they changed their stories and either couldn't remember or didn't see. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but barely anything tangible, so it soon became a case of knowing who had been part of that bloodthirsty mob, but not being able to pin anything on them. For example, one afternoon, our van drove past a man repairing a fence at a homestead only 3 or 4 kilometers away from the kill house. One of the translators saw him as he drove past and started pointing and talking to the other in a way that we couldn't understand. We quickly switched to English and explained how the man we'd passed had been spotted unloading bodies from a truck back during the genocide. But what disturbed me the most was how the man politely waved as we passed. It was like he didn't have a care in the world. Like all the violence had been swept under the carpet by people who could just switch off that part of themselves and go back to normal. We exhumed what we could from the pit in the backyard, then photographed, measured, and sealed everything away in evidence bags. We spent one last day in Kigali debriefing with members of the tribunal and the UN, but the conclusions were stark. We had boxes of bones and clothing samples, and my report was thick with notes. But when all was said and done, convicting just one of the Homestead executioners would mark the achievement of a lifetime, but all of them, that was as close to impossible as it was possible to be. The case was provisionally docketed but never brought to trial. The landscape of the investigation was an ever-shifting one which constantly had new priorities, new mass graves, and new political realities to deal with. We later heard that the only identifiable subject had died of malaria in a refugee camp, disguised as a victim of the genocide and not a perpetrator. But the others are still free to walk among the same communities they once terrorized. They are businessmen, minor officials, and respected elders. They attend church on Sundays with people they'd shed blood with. Their children go to school with the children of some of their victims. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Brussels, I open the sealed plastic container I kept against all protocol. Inside is one small red sandal, sized for a child of perhaps 6 years old. I don't know why I kept it. Evidence of failure, maybe, or perhaps a reminder that justice is not a natural force, but a fragile human invention that is easily starved of resources and will. And that's why all those shoes we found will stay empty and those of the killers wander far and free. The world, as I've found, moves on far, far too easily. I don't work for the UN anymore, but it sometimes comes up in conversation with the youngest lawyers I work with. They sometimes ask how I coped, and I tell them the truth. I didn't cope with anything. Everything I saw, everything I heard, I still carry it with me. I remember the smell of that house and the small blue sweater with the knitted duck and the rows of silent shoes. I'm told the compound near Nyamata still stands, but locals avoid it after dark. The country itself has forgotten, but the people still remember, and so do I. Back in the 70s, my old man used to be a homicide detective here in Houston. He worked some brutal cases over the years, and he's told me many a story that's replayed in my head when the lights are off and I'm just curled in bed in silence. But out of all of them, this is the one that stayed with me for the longest, and it's all to do with what he always called the Orchard Apartment murders. So back in the late 70s, Houston was booming with oil money, and all that oil money had people pouring into the city trying to get a piece of it. But whenever there's a big influx of people from elsewhere, some of which are going to be very down on their luck, you get yourself a little spike in crime to go along with it. Dad said the number of homicides spiked, not by much, but it was noticeable, and then one night, it started. I double-checked just to make sure, but the night on the first murder was July 27th of 1979, and no prizes for guessing this happened at the Orchard Apartments in southwest Houston. Most of the units are pretty small, so they tend to house a lot of single workaday folks, and the same was true even back then for a lady named Alice Rankin. Now Google's telling me she was a 33-year-old secretary and single mom, and then one morning, since her car was in the shop, a coworker of hers stops by to give her a ride to the office. Now he's buzzing her apartment, but she's not answering, right? So he gets inside somehow and then walks all the way up to her place, only to find the door slightly ajar. The guy then steps inside to take a look around and see if Alice is okay. And then when he walks into the bedroom, it must have been like walking onto the set of a horror movie. There's Alice, lying on her bed with no clothes on. Her feet are tied, and there's a pillow covering her from the neck up. But when the coworker pulls the pillow away, there's no Alice to check on at all. Just a stump where her head used to be. Someone had her killed, violated her, then took her head with them as a trophy. Now my dad said that there was a blood trail that went all the way from Alice's apartment to the building's rear entrance, meaning whoever cut her head off just straight up walked out of the building with it, probably holding it by the hair. Alice's head was never found, and neither was her killer. But Dad said that right as they were still working out to figure out the first murder, the second hit less than 2 weeks later. Alice Rankin's apartment wasn't a crime scene anymore, and the cops had no reason to closely guard the building, because why would they? Dad said everyone figured that it was a crime of passion, maybe a former lover that had taken their breakup a little too hard and thought, if I can't have her, no one can. No one figured the killer would return to the exact same building to do the exact same thing. But that's exactly what they did. 2 weeks later, and 2 floors up, a lady named Mary Calcutta rented an apartment after moving here from Pittsburgh. Her friends back home had heard all about what had happened to Alice Rankin, so they'd been telling her to lock her doors, look over her shoulder, don't talk to strangers, all that kind of stuff. And she told them that she'd be extra careful, and I'm sure she was too, but sadly, that didn't save her. Much like Alice, she was found naked in her bedroom, but instead of being tied up and decapitated, Dad said it looked like Mary had put up one heck of a fight. It wasn't so much a case of looking for signs of a struggle, as looking for a place there hadn't been one, and it was probably thanks to how hard she fought that her killer didn't have time to completely cut her head off. He slit her throat and stabbed her a bunch of times, but the fight was so loud that he was probably scared that someone had called the cops. So instead of calmly walking out with Mary's head swinging in his grip, this monster probably ran for his life. Now, my old man said he was convinced the same guy did Alice and Mary. It was the same apartment complex, 2 women living alone in the same brutal style of killing in each case. Every other woman at Orchard Apartments thought that they were next too, and Dad said that they were all buying guns, walking in groups at night, or straight up packing up and moving elsewhere. The panic was real, especially because the very same day Mary's body was found, another body showed up on the other side of town. Dad said it was an exterminator that walked into this lady's townhouse on Early Lane after he showed up for an appointment that she made with him. And that's when he found this girl, Doris Threadgill, with her neck cut most of the way through. This time there were no signs of any struggle, and I know it's only a small mercy, but Doris was thankfully found with her clothes on. Dad said the scene made it look like he'd gained entry to the house under false pretenses, almost like Doris thought her killer was the exterminator and didn't realize he wasn't until it was too late. It was just different enough for some to suggest it was the work of a different psycho altogether, but Dad was never convinced. He said the work on her neck was just too similar, that the MO matched in all the right places for him, and they got chills thinking Houston now had its very own spree killer, maybe even a serial killer, to use what, at the time, was a fancy new term. Dad said things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, and it wasn't just his own caseload, everyone else's was piling up too. And then suddenly, things did somehow manage to get worse when the dead bodies of a teenage couple showed up miles apart from each other. The girl's body was found in a park someplace. Now, Google is saying it was at Watonga, but I'd swear that my dad said it was Freed. But the boy's body was found in a used car lot, but only his body, not his head. That was missing. Dad said that there was nothing in the way of strong forensic evidence to link it to the apartment murders, so officially speaking, they were seen as unconnected. But again, my dad has no doubt. He thinks the same killer spotted the girl alone and maybe even attacked her out in the open that night. But when he was interrupted by her boyfriend, it was him who suddenly became the target for getting his head cut off. Dad and his squad ran down every lead, fingerprints, witnesses, knives, everything. But since there was no DNA technology back then, they had to do everything the hard way and without computers. Dad said that he heard they submitted evidence later for testing, but no hits came back. And since at the time not even a single likely suspect was named, there was no arrests either. No arrests, no trial, no justice, nothing. Dad retired without closing it, and whenever he used to tell me the story, he'd always end up shaking his head, grumbling about how the families never got any peace or justice. He said the way Orchard Apartments got hit twice in quick succession, and how the killer liked taking heads, it suggested a kind of evil that was almost like unholy, you know? Whoever killed those poor people, and either cut their damn heads off or tried to, they were crazy as an outhouse rat, no doubt about it. But at the time, they were smart enough to make sure that they never got caught, and even real smart people aren't smart enough to not get caught slipping. You also got to remember neither of the 2 missing heads were ever recovered, meaning that maybe somewhere, out there was an old man with 2 frozen heads in a unit, and he takes them out every so often, ageless and looking the same as they did almost half a century ago, which really is like something out of a horror movie. Dad always said that that was the one case he'd do anything to be able to go back and solve, and I can understand why. Being able to bring justice to those poor families would have been quite something, but I imagine putting that sick son of a bitch in cuffs after working so incredibly hard to track him down, that would have been a heck of a thing too. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, life isn't free. The way one falls from such a high jump, flop, flop, floppy.